People keep asking me, what happened with the Caleb Downs recruitment? They thought that it was a done deal, that Georgia was going to get who I saw as the best player in the transfer portal, whether it had been through the original window or that second chance when Nick Saban got retired. And he ends up choosing Ohio State, right? And is it money? Is it that he just didn't want to go to Georgia in the first place? It's probably a mixture of all that. Is it that he can be the star in a secondary? I think Ohio State secondary is pretty good, but he spoke to the media. He spoke to the media for the first time in the last 24 hours, speaking to Ohio State media, local media. He answered some questions about it. He says there was a lot of back and forth in his decision, and I think that was evident just in the reporting, right? Nick Saban retires. Then all of a sudden, immediately everyone's like, oh, well, is Kirby Smart going to get Caleb Downs? Is Georgia going to get Caleb Downs? And then there's traction. Now you hear, oh, Caleb Downs is in Athens. Oh, Kirby Smart's in Buford. You hear all this and that. And then I get a Bleacher Report notification. I think it was Bleacher Report. It could have been ESPN, whoever it was. Caleb Downs is visiting Ohio State. And then I was like, well, this is a guy that didn't really have Georgia at the top of his list in high school. And he's a guy who had Ohio State second on his list after Alabama. And, the people and the place matters a lot in these decisions. I don't know what the dollars and cents were. You can't really trust a lot of these reports about the dollars and cents when it comes to these athletes and these collectives and what's actually being distributed. And, he got asked point blank, why'd you choose Ohio State over Georgia? And he kind of avoids the question a little bit, but it was all about how much he believed in Ryan Day, how much he believed in Ohio State. And so my answer to the question is, I think he really just wanted to go to Ohio State. I think that's just what the kid wanted. I think it's what the guy wanted, right? I mean, obviously he's a legal adult at this point, like a year into college, or at least, he's got to be about a year into college by now. I'm assuming he was an early enrollee for Alabama. But Downs doesn't pick Georgia, right? And this is something that we need to bookend, right? Like, this needs to be over. It's not the primary focus on Georgia anymore. It's not a focus at all because it is in the past, and he is now an Ohio State Buckeye. It would have been great for Georgia. So one last time, in relation a little bit, right? We'll move on a little bit from Caleb Downs in this conversation and start moving on over to what Georgia's secondary is, what they need to fill. They've got to fill some holes leadership-wise. They've got to fill some hole talent-wise. They've got to fill some hole production-wise in that secondary. And the reason why it felt like this was a big loss was because of how good Caleb Downs is, how good he and Malachi Starks would have been next to each other. I told people, look, if Downs and Starks are next to each other, Kirby's never had a safety duo that good. I don't know how many people have had a safety duo that good if we're talking about from just a raw talent standpoint. I mean, Caleb Downs was over 100 tackles. He was the best defensive player on Alabama's team this past season as a true freshman. And Malachi Starks is one of the best defensive players in college football. Pair them together in a secondary room, and it would be pretty sick. Ryan Curley from Dawg Post here talking about Georgia's secondary. We'll move on from Caleb Downs, but just wanted to let you know that he did come out and say that it had a lot to do with Ryan Day. It had a lot to do with believing in Ohio State, believing in what they were doing on defense, right? Didn't make many comments about why it was or wasn't Georgia, but it wasn't Georgia. And Georgia's got to replace Tyke Smith at that star position, right? They've got to replace his 70 tackles, his 2 sacks, his 4 interceptions. They got to replace John Bullard's 56 tackles, his 2 interceptions, his presence all over the field, his 3 interceptions against TCU, his sacks against Tennessee in 2022, right? Obviously that was a year prior, but Javon Bullard obviously was one of the leaders of this Georgia football team, right? Remember the halftime locker room deal. There's a few guys up talking. There's a few guys up being the leaders. Carson Beck out there winking at people. Cedric Van barking at people. Javon Bullard doing the same thing. And Javon Bullard wasn't even a full participant in that game, right? He gets hurt a little bit early in the season. Kamari Lassiter, one of the best cover corners Georgia's had recently, right? Not a lot of production headed his way. I think he only allowed 100 yards max this past season. He doesn't get any interceptions. Not really what he's known for. One of the best open field tacklers at the corner position I've seen in a while, to be quite frank. They got to replace his production as well, right? His 37 tackles. These are all guys that are towards the top, if not at the top of the list in production on Georgia's defense from last year. And they were contributors to the defense the year before, right? All guys that were out there playing. Tyke Smith, not quite as much, right, as the other two, but he obviously was a huge part of Georgia's defense in 2023. So they've got to replace that. Caleb Downs would have made that easier. Caleb Downs would have made it seamless. Well, you know, what is Jake Pope going to come in and start immediately for Georgia, right? He doesn't really see the field in 2022, right? He's a red shirt for Alabama. In year 2, right? He plays, but he's not really a big deal over there. He's playing behind Caleb Downs. Georgia gets him. He's going to have an opportunity to come in and compete for the starting job immediately. Will guys like David Daniel, Sisavon step up? Will guys like Ja'Cory Thomas step up, right? Players that have been in the program for at least a year now. David Daniel being in the program for about 3 years. Those guys. Is it going to be an older guy? Is Dan Jackson going to get a lot of snaps again? We've seen him get a lot of snaps in the past in that dime package. They like to use him as that 6th defensive back, and maybe you'll see that again. And there are some really talented freshmen that are coming in, right? There's KJ Bolden, a 5-star safety, a guy that, you know, he played both ways in high school, a very electric athlete, a guy that's really fast, a guy, there's a reason why they're going to put him on defense and not offense, but he probably could be on either side of the football. He was Dylan Raiola's top target this past season, and I believe almost every other catch was a touchdown, right? He had about 30 catches, about 14 touchdowns. It was a pretty ridiculous season for KJ Bolden on the offensive end in terms of just what you got out of it, right? The efficiency in his production, not necessarily his total production. Dello Jones, a guy down from Swainsboro, a guy that earned a 5-star ranking recently from On3. He's a high 4-star according to ESPN, according to 24/7, all those. To me, this guy is a real problem on the football field. A guy that can play all sorts of positions, and guys like that, they get put a defensive back under Kirby Smart more often than not. And Malachi Starks is an example of that, right? I am very high on Dello Jones from what I've seen from him. He's someone I expect to contribute at some point, whether it's in 2024 or beyond. That's the player that I'm excited to watch in the red and black. So those are the 3 freshmen. There's Andre Evans as well, not as highly rated, but another highly touted corner, but he's not quite on the level as them as in terms of high school perception and what they are in the recruiting rankings. But that's kind of what you're working with for Georgia. And then I'd be remiss not to at least discuss at corner, because I think Dello Jones can play corner or safety. I kind of threw his name out there in terms of an athlete, a guy could return kicks if you wanted to as well. The other question is it just going to be Jalen Everett and Julian Humphrey? Because that would be the best way to assume, I guess, right? Make an assumption just based off of production and based off of seniority, right? It would be Dalen Everett and Julian Humphrey at those corner positions, but the number 1 player in the high school class, at least a top 5 consensus player, Ellis Robinson. You would expect a guy like that to make a real push to start their freshman year. Keely Ringo was making a push, or at least had an opportunity to. He didn't play much his actual freshman year. That second year, he starts immediately. So maybe it is a situation like that where Ellis Robinson can come in and contribute immediately. At that star position, they've got all sorts of athletes to choose from. Janelle Aguero is the name that I kind of point to a little bit. They're really high on him, former 5-star safety, right, from last year's class. I think that he'll end up being the star if I had to predict it today. Again, spring's coming up soon, so we'll actually get to know a little bit more about these battles. But just a little bit of a discussion about the secondary, obviously revolving around the fact that Caleb Downs did not choose Georgia. He chose Ohio State, and he finally spoke to the media a little bit about that. Said it was back and forth, that his heart was back and forth. His heart dropped when Nick Saban retired, and it came down. It seems like it came down to more of Ohio State than it did about Georgia. I feel like I fumbled a little bit through this video, so if you made it to the end with me, thank you for watching, and make sure you're signing up for our newsletter. That link is down below.